I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Merge Medical Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Brown. I'm joined by Dr. Jeff Cole, my favorite co-host. And we're joined today by the C-suite of RevBio. Brian Hess is the CEO and founder, along with Grayson Allen. He's the CFO, COO, and co-founder, the man of many hats. RevBio is a transformational bone glue that I've been really excited to hear about. Brian, Grayson, tell us about RevBio.
Yeah, sure. So RevBio, we are developing a regenerative biomaterial. It's a bone adhesive. We believe in the current state of art, surgeries are complex and really surgeons are limited on their materials. They often use orthopedic plates and screws to repair bone, damaged bone. And very often these are complex surgeries. And in addition to fixating the bone with hardware, they often require an adjunctive biomaterial. What makes the adhesive so unique is that it can glue bone back together, and it also is osteo-promotive, which means it can help regenerate bone during the healing process. And so our goal is to really advance the current state and really help patients accelerate their return to function and reduce their pain, and also try to eliminate or reduce the complication rate, the number of times surgeons have to revise and go back in and correct things. And by doing so, we think we're really going to advance patient care.
Well, so this would replace like an intramedullary rod for a femur fracture?
Possibly. I mean, that's probably would be like a great opportunity in the future to at least augment rods and screws. We do think there are many fractures where we could eliminate hardware, but at very first case, we're looking to bring this technology in as an augment to metal fixation for extremity fractures. But there's certain many applications, like for brain surgery, neurosurgeons use plates and screws to fixate the cranial flap. And that's a great opportunity for us because it's a non-load-bearing region to obviate the need for plates and screws, but also provide osteo-promotive material to help with bone fusion.
My understanding, your first two applications are the ones you're studying now are for that, for the cranium, and then for dental applications. Can you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. We got two different opportunities going on at first. For dental, we're looking to advance the current state where a surgeon would take someone's failing tooth out and they would look to rebuild the jaw, and they would have to stage that out very often before they could place a dental implant, which would then support a prosthetic or a crown. With the bone adhesive, we're enabling the surgeon to place the dental implant in the very same procedure as when they take out the tooth. And so we're collapsing two surgical procedures down to one. Obviously, that is a great value proposition to patients because we simplify their life in terms of bringing their restoration back to normal. And then for cranial flap, as I said, we're using the glue to fixate the cranial flap bone back to the skull following a long brain surgery. And then over time, because we're obviating the place of hardware, the material is osteo-promotive. And so the curve space and the gaps that were necessary to create that cranial flap are bridged by new bone as the material is replaced during the healing process.
And I've had a couple of crowns myself, and it's multiple trips to get that all done. Like,
yeah,
you go get the root canal from a cracked tooth, and then that fails, and then they, take that out. You have to get, what do they call it, an impression done, and they send that off. If you could reduce that to 2 trips, that's revolutionary, just in and of itself. So, when you're doing the bone flaps or anything else, how long does it take to harden? You put it on the existing bone where the flap is missing, and then put the flap back on, and then how long does that take just to be as hard as bone?
It just takes a few minutes. So we provide the surgeon a kit, and inside the kit are delivery devices, and we've got a really unique innovation where we've got these intra-op fixation aids. So that basically holds the flap level with the skull and gets it perfectly aligned. And then we're allowed to inject the glue into the space. And then the surgeon just sort of sculpts the material into position, removes any excess. There's sort of like an idealized viscosity. It's not too runny, of course, but yet it's flowable. So within minutes, the surgeon can, essentially get the material all worked in there, and then it goes through a hardening process. And by 10 minutes, it's as hard as a rock. And the flap is well adhered. It's bonded to the bone. And then they can go on and they can close that case right up.
Things about the technology where we can tune that working time based on how we design the product. And that's a big factor for different surgeons, because we see this as a platform technology where it could be used literally from head to toe. And so certainly for neurosurgeons, they have a particular amount of time that they want to spend putting that flap back in. In other cases, perhaps where there's complex trauma for, like, say, an orthopedic surgeon that's trying to repair like a distal radius compression fracture, they may want a little bit more time for the product to set because they're reopposing bones. They're trying to make sure alignment is correct to reduce the likelihood of osteoarthritis down the road. So we work a lot with surgeons from different disciplines when we try to field a product for that specific use to make sure that we're meeting the needs of those surgeons, because they have their they plan their operations, obviously, and they want to be able to use that material in an effective way. So that's one of the key things that we've done as part of our product design and development processes.
How do you prevent, when you're applying material in the setting of a cranial flap, that you don't put too much and it run like into the brain itself, and then you've got this rock hard element underneath not where the flap is, but an existing skull and et cetera?
That's a really good question. And that's one of the things that FDA questioned us as we're going through the development process and applying and ultimately getting approval to initiate clinical trials. They wanted to make sure that the material was controllable and that it wouldn't go into places where it shouldn't be, which could cause deleterious effects. And so we spent a lot of time making sure that the viscosity of the material is correct and how it's delivered too, through specific gauge cannula, so that it would fill that initial space, but because we've controlled for viscosity, it's not going to like ooze out. Like when you make a peanut butter jelly sandwich and you put the top piece of bread on, you don't want it to ooze out, on the sides. And so we spent a lot of time perfecting that, and then also testing that in preclinical studies, and then serving that data up to FDA. And ultimately, they're satisfied with all the mitigation that we did to ensure that that wouldn't happen. And ultimately, we got approved to start our clinical trials.
That's great. Can you talk about your regulatory pathway, where you've been and where you're headed?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, it's an innovative product, right? And so we don't have a precedent or a predicate device that's currently on the market. And so we're really trailblazing a path forward with the FDA. Depending on the indication, we work with different branches of the FDA. But at this point, we've worked with nearly all of them, and they now communicate across divisions, because this is a platform technology. So what one division learns can be shared with the other. Obviously, we do testing on the bench, we do it in animals, and then that allows us to test it in humans. And that really is the step we have to take to ultimately get our product approved. This is going to be regulated as a device, but in some cases, a combination product, a device-led combination product. A device because it's serving a real biomechanical function. It's holding things back together. It's adhering bone to bone, or it could be adhering a metal implant to bone. However, as I talked earlier, this is a material that's therapeutic in the sense that it is regenerative. Over time, the material is resorbed in the body and it's replaced with new bone. But what the FDA has said is that the device is the primary function. And so the device branch will lead all of the reviews for our products, but they will, look at the therapeutic effect to make sure that there's no questions of safety and toxicity of putting our compound into the body. Of course, our product is endogenous. The materials that make up the bone adhesive, these are endogenous to the human body. So we're not putting in foreign materials.
And they promote osteoblast formation then, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the therapeutic effect. The FDA calls that chemical action. And so what that basically means, it has an influence on the cells in the body. And so in this case, you said the osteoblasts, those are the bone forming cells. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what it does. It promotes the formation and helps them differentiate. And that's what you want. You want a material that if it's put in there to do a job of fixing bone and then help promoting new bone, you want that therapeutic action. And so this is a device-led combination product, and that's how it'll be regulated.
So you talked about it supplementing fixation, but is there any thought that the modulus of elasticity is close enough that you could actually make screws out of it, or
Yeah,
fixation
we
out of it?
actually that's actually a great idea. I mean, one of the ideas is how can this material be used in intra-op, to or even pre-op to form a device like a physical shape, maybe an analog to a hardware. It could be an analog to a cage for spine surgery. It could be an analog for a different form factor of the material. And so part of our IP is, we bring not only the glue in the kit, but in certain situations, you could imagine filling large voids and having a preformed block of this material that then is glued into space to fill a space and serve as a scaffold then for the bone to bridge and to form a fusion over time.
Do you think
Yeah.
this would be something like where if you had like a major, say, ankle fracture with multiple parts needing to be put back together, could
Yep.
the surgeon like Humpty Dumpty get put back together again with this product?
Yeah, it's kind of how we explain it to a lot of people. I mean, this is putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. And anywhere you have bone, and anywhere you have some defect, whether it's a hole, a crack, multiple cracks, comminution, like you talked about
Yeah.
in the ankle or near the articular surface in your wrist or along your spine. Obviously, we talked about the cranium, the face, really anywhere from head to toe, as Grayson said before. When you need to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, this is a material that can provide a surgeon with a completely new capability that they don't have today. And therein lies the real game-changing solution, we think. And we always say, liken it to like a carpenter, right? They've been putting things back together with, a hammer and a nail or a screw or a bolt and a wrench. But then along came wood glue or some kind of glue, and that probably made their life remarkably less complex. They pull into that tool chest what they need for the job. And I think this is us bringing surgeons the glue, the glue that they've always sort of dreamed to have to make things less complicated.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that, because intuitively it would seem like if I don't have as much hardware, I'd have less infection risk. So when you talk about comminuted fractures, you talk about that occurs from trauma. And I could see where a lot of those would be open fractures.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got bacteria introduced into the site. Have you guys looked at infection risk? Is it increased, decreased?
Well, I mean, we've been all over the body now. We've been in dental. And that's a septic environment, an open, cavity there to the mouth.
Right.
We've been in the cranial spaces we talked about, spine and animals, and then the extremities, as you talked about, and even open wounds. Obviously, there's different situations, as you talked about, open versus closed. You have young patients, old patients. They all have different risk factors. And I would say we have not seen anything in healthy individuals, especially in closed environments. When you go to open, though, I would say all bets are off, and you have to assume that infection can get in. It's a question of strategy. So, for example, it's very common to load a bone cement with an antibiotic. And so there are predicate bone cements out there, not adhesives. We talked about that, but bone cements, materials that fill voids, they don't chemically bond to bone, and they're loaded with antibiotics. And so there already is sort of like a pattern there where we've got intellectual property, we've done prior testing on the bench, now in animals, where we can load our material up with a different form of antibiotics, depending on the need. And our material can allow that antibiotic to locally release over sustained periods of time. And that's really important to get back to what you said. If you know you're going into an open wound to treat this, there's probably going to be a lot of existing bacteria or new bacteria. And so the best defense is to be thinking through that. And so there's a huge need. And so we think of ourselves as bringing the bone glue to market and then working through a strategy to bring an antibiotic loading sort of product portfolio with that for these types of nasty injuries, as you said.
Do you think that would require additional studies just to prove it doesn't change the biomechanical strength of the material?
It'll definitely require additional testing, not only in terms of changing the biomechanical capabilities of our material, but also understanding the release profile of whatever drug we're trying to release. Because essentially we'd be taking this product and basically making it a drug delivery device, if you will. And in fact, we've won grant funding to do just that. And the specific indication for that is actually wisdom tooth extraction sites, where typically, and of course this has been a major pandemic in the United States, of opioid addiction. A lot of young young teenagers become addicted to opiates because after wisdom teeth extractions, that's what they have been historically prescribed. And so we thought, gee, if there's a way where we could locally release a pain medication, that would really change the game. And so we actually won significant NIH grant funding to do just that. And so we're in the midst of that program, and that'll sort of be the first example of releasing some sort of drug compound out of tetranite. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, where else do we go? Obviously in orthopedics with polytrauma, where you have a high risk of infection, that's another great opportunity to make just a better product and a better overall outcome. And so that's one of our goals as part of our product pipeline.
That's great. Have you received other grants? It just has me curious about your history, from first forming and where you've been raise wise. If you're currently raising, are you an A raise, or where are you? And again, is that the only grant that you've received, or have you had others?
Yeah, we've actually received significant grant funding, which has been really exciting, especially for the angel investors that have invested in RevBio. To date, we have not raised an institutional round, but we're prepping for that. Right now, we are actually issuing convertible notes as a part of a convertible note round. Those notes basically have a 6% accruing interest rate, and then they convert into the Series A round, which is our next planned round, at a 20% discount to that pricing. So it's an interesting opportunity, and we've provided opportunities like this in the past, which is why we've raised significant funding from angel investors, especially those that are part of the medical community, because I think they immediately see the value of this technology and how it can make these either dental or orthopedic procedures, much less difficult. It provides new capabilities that aren't there right now with existing metal fixation hardware. And so it's been really exciting. We've raised a lot of grant funding, about $20 million to date. And that's been part of our strategy where, again, we see this technology as a platform. And so it's all about finding really unique indications where there's a definite need for a new product that has capabilities that, as I said, metal fixation can't fully accomplish. And so we've seeded a lot of those programs with grant funding. And of course, our investors like that because it's non-dilutive. And It's basically a way of leveraging their capital to get much further along. And that's how, we've proceeded. So that's been a key strategy that has really kind of gotten us to where we are with multiple indications at various stages of development, some in clinical, some still in preclinical, but all moving towards the commercialized state.
And very validating too, because if you think about it, to win one of these grants, it's quite a bit of competition out there. And for the grants that we're receiving now, these are typically on the order of at least $2 million. These are phase 2 grants. And at the stage we're at right now, commercialization is the key. And so these are small business grants with a goal of trying to get these products to market. So, obviously a company like us could be sustainable. And so we have to craft, well-articulated business plans for these grants. It's about the technology. This is about, is there a product market fit? How would you go to market with this technology? Do you have customer feedback? Are they going to adopt the product? What's the regulatory and clinical strategy? We have to really think about this. And now we're even thinking about reimbursement. And we've done some phenomenal work on our programs, specifically the cranial flap program, on working with CMS to get reimbursement. And so a lot of these grants has forced us to really put the pen down, to the paper and really articulate this to reviewers, that have been sort of brought together to kind of look at these opportunities, see what's going to actually work and get to market. And so by winning these grants, it's very validating, especially to our investors, as we said. And in many cases, it fuels future investment from our angel investors. So there's like a very compounding effect to the grant process and the benefits when you do win an award.
Are you seeing any more difficulty getting grants now with, Doge cutting things? And I don't want to get political, just matter of fact.
It's part of the landscape that we live in. So all politics aside, we haven't seen any issues to date. We've got several active grants. We're able to pull down on funding from those grants. We actually have been shortlisted for a grant, and we actually just went through sort of a final process before they make a full determination, and that's called the just-in-time information request, where they send out a request for key updates since, we filed our application, because as you know, these cycles take a while. So several months pass. They want to make sure that, we haven't overcommitted on other grant funding, and that, our certifications as a small business are still in place. And so we just went through that process with a grant that's pending. So we haven't seen any issues. It seems like really the focus has been on large academic institutions that have very high overhead rates, which we have to deal with when we partner with a hospital for a clinical trial. So we haven't seen any perturbations yet. It is really interesting. I mean, this type of funding is, I think, crucial. I mean, everyone talks about startups and the proverbial valley of death, where we're trying to get to that next level. These grants have been extremely helpful to us because we have to do these large preclinical animal studies. Expensive, they're very complex. And so that's what a lot of these phase 2 grant application funding mechanisms have really done for us. They've allowed us to fund those critical studies. And then armed with the data from those studies, that not only gets us into the clinical studies, but it also is great data for investors to really see that there is a real valuable indication that we're going after, and the product is safe and effective.
Thinking futuristically, with you being a platform, if a large orthopedic company came as a suitor to purchase, are you structured such that the neurosurgery line would be separate or the dental line would be separate, or how does that work?
Yeah, we can basically segregate out those different indications. And so we can be efficient. And that, I think, provides a lot of optionality for our investors, in the sense that, there probably is no single logical acquirer, because we are in different markets. So, if necessary, if the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, that's something we can pursue, because obviously our goal is to, number one, get products into the market that are based on this technology, which we think will ultimately change how orthopedic and dental procedures are performed. But then secondly, we want to maximize value to our investors, because they're the ones that are funding this. And so whether it's the sum of the parts or the whole, we're agnostic. We just want to get the products to market, and we want to do right by our investors.
Grayson, when I was a medical student, I did do a neurosurgery rotation. I got the privilege of spending a lot of time with the bone flap rep, the guy that provided the screws and the hardware to put the bone flaps on, and I was stunned at how much that stuff costs. I mean, it's just staggering what a 5mm screw. How, Brian, you were talking about reimbursement. Tell us about how that's going to compare with the existing technology, both for the bone flaps, and then you can talk about the cost comparison for the dental part too.
Yeah. I'll say a couple comments in Grayson as well. Grayson's done a lot of work, both of us have, really thinking about the healthcare economics of our product, because unlike dental's primary out of the patient's pocket. I mean, there is dental insurance, but most of the dental insurance doesn't cover the surgical phase of the type of events that could happen. But for brain surgery and the cranial flap indication, it's done in a hospital. And so that's right, inpatient, and that's covered by insurance. And so as a payer, they're very interested, and we think we can make a great case that we could, really change the game in terms of potential cost structure of these surgeries, because you're right, on a large bone flap, they might put in, up to 5, even some surgeons have said 6 or 7 bone plates to sort of strap that cranial flap, nice all the way around. And then each bone plate has at least 2 screws. And then they use a burr hole cover to cover the burr holes, which are the holes that they make to make entry. And those each take 5. So you add it all up, there's a lot of hardware. And if you circle that all up and put that on a ledger and compare it to the bone glue, which is 1 unit, it makes a lot of sense on some of the economics we can make. And that's all because our technology is based on a synthetic technology. It's made out of molecules that are relatively low cost to manufacture. And so we can sort of operate with a very nice gross profit margin. And so that structure of the basis of our material, right, the cost, and then how we can deliver sort of like a single point solution with a kit versus, all these plates and screws. And that's not even to mention, very often, a surgeon will use to augment the plates and screws. They'll fill in all those holes with a self-setting bone cement. Again, not an adhesive. And so that adds even more layers of cost. And so we've been able to do a good job of sort of like summarizing all that and starting to work with CMS. And Grayson, maybe you can just talk about some of the work we've done.
Sure. Yeah, one of the key things, as Brian was stating, was, we look at sort of the value of what this product can bring, and not only is it neutral in time, and actually, as we've found based on some of the studies that we've done, it actually is quicker to apply than preparing the bone flaps with plates and then adhering them into place with the screws. We've found that it's a little bit less time. So that's a value to surgeons. It is definitely conformal. You don't have protrusions under your skin, so that's great for patients. And then because it seals the flap, there is the potential that it could actually reduce CSF leaks, which become sort of a pathway to infection to the brain. So, there's a lot of value that we feel this product brings that existing products don't have. So that was a key factor in terms of thinking about how we price this product. We still haven't finalized our pricing, but as Brian mentioned, we approached CMS because we know that for these in-hospital settings where we're going to use the material, reimbursement is a key factor. And so we approached them and we showed what we believed was our value proposition. And we showed all of our preclinical testing and all of the work that we've done and a lot of publications that have come out of that. And they said, well, this looks really interesting, but come back once you have 5 patients. And we want to see that the value is really being delivered. And so one of our earliest cases was a huge craniectomy where the patient had a stroke and they had to remove a large segment of their skull as part of a decompression strategy so that the brain could swell and then reduce without being damaged because of the size of the skull. And so we showed that to CMS and they gave us approval. And so it was really exciting that they saw the value as well. And I think part of it is, all the work that we've done on our grant applications, we've learned how to articulate the value of the technology in such a way that they also were able to see that. And so that allowed us to get approval. So now, as part of our clinical trials, hospitals are actually paying for our product. So we're starting to set pricing, but obviously we need to go through a next wave, as Brian alluded to, which is healthcare economics. What are some of the downstream effects where we could actually save hospitals money, where maybe there's a lower readmission rate because of complications down the road? That's something that we need to explore, and we're starting to look at real world data from some of the sites where we're doing our clinical trials to really understand how can we improve care, not just at the immediate point of care, but also downstream, so that there are less side effects, less readmissions, less adverse events.
Yeah. Fewer revisions, and even I can imagine in orthopedics there are situations where there's a planned staged procedure where you just may not have to do that second procedure.
You're onto something there, because when a patient has a really complex, fracture of a long bone extremity, very often, and it's also infected, and they have to devitalize and remove fragments of bone, and they're left with a large gap. And often in polytrauma, as you know, they have to just stabilize the situation and then come back later for a staged surgery. But with this, because you have a material that can fill, but it can also fixate. It's also a scaffold, but it could also potentially release an antibiotic. You have a multi-point sort of, you're addressing multiple factors that in polytrauma you have to deal with a single solution that is delivered to the wound, right, during these complex procedures. And so if we can kind of simplify and get it all done to one nice surgery and get the devitalized bone out of there, fill those gaps, but then stabilize, and then have the material in there ready to promote the bone healing. Now you don't have to go through so many surgeries, which obviously is great for the patient, but just from physiology and healing, you're not having to go back in there, which surgery alone is invasive. So there's healing from surgery due to that. And so we're just trying to simplify these complex surgeries with the material that we've obviously described at this point.
I feel like filling gaps and reducing micromotion, you probably remove a risk for infection, because when you've got that potential space that's no longer there, it's filled with your product, I would think that's protective.
Yeah, that's exactly a piece of the sort of like the science, right? Like if you can just get it, our material is a temporary replacement of bone, right? Where bone once was, this is where the material is positioned, and then biology is taking over. It's replacing that material and it's substituting it more or less in a one-to-one fashion with real bone, and you don't have all this artifact of hardware in there. And in many cases, like you say, you've got gaps. And so now you've got a continuous segment of bone, which, that's how it's supposed to be.
We've talked a good bit about the clinical side of this. I'd like to know more about you guys' background. I mean, I know, but the listeners won't know who you guys are. If you guys each want to give us a little brief bio and, other projects that you've been involved with, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I think we have a very complementary background. Mine starts on the engineering side, working in the medtech space, specifically with biomaterials. I worked at, Stryker, so I have, appreciation of a large, very successful organization. I've had the opportunity to work with many surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons when I was at Stryker, thinking about solutions for surgery. And I saw this huge need to, what if they would say we had a bone adhesive? So I had the opportunity at Stryker to work on a project to innovate a material like this. And that aha moment came. It was a remarkable innovation, of course. Many people thought, this really would change the future state. But it was a complex technology in the sense that it would take time and money to go through all the clinical proofs. They realized that. And so they essentially, I guess, put it on the shelf for a period of time. I went back to business school because my motivation at that point was, I really want to be an entrepreneur. It's great to invent, but I want to take these great technologies all the way to market. And so I went back to business school, and that's where I met Grayson. And Grayson can kind of pick up his story, and we can merge it together.
Yeah. I mean, my background, as Brian said, is complementary because I've basically built a career in finance and operations. And so I started out in commercial banking, financing a lot of companies, underwriting commercial loans. Then I went into the private equity group of the bank, and we did every type of transaction from early stage venture capital to leverage buyouts to growth equity to even fund to funds investing. We're investing in other venture or private equity funds. And so I got a real understanding of the sort of the finance world from that, but also that itch I also had in terms of wanting to be an entrepreneur. So I ended up leaving that, jumping into a startup. Initially, that startup was in a different industry. It was in the aerospace industry, but another highly regulated, concentrated industry where you've got a few major players. And so I worked with that company. That company actually was developing satellite antenna systems for internet on airplanes. And of course, now that's become somewhat ubiquitous, but at the time it was cutting edge. And so I grew that company to profitability and an ultimate sale. And then being a glutton for punishment, I did some turnaround work where I was working with companies that were their performance was trailing off, and so they needed some retooling. And then I did a bunch of CFO interim engagements where, again, it was either companies that were trailing in their performance or companies that were trying to prep for rapid growth and acceleration. And so, I had the same motivation. I went back to business school. We both went to MIT Sloan, which is a great school that has a real great ecosystem around it in terms of technology, entrepreneurism. And so Brian and I met there and we started collaborating on some projects and talking about our backgrounds. And sure enough, it was a great fit. And so we decided to pursue this together.
Yeah, and we basically, merge medical. It's kind of funny thinking about the terms here today because we merged our paths together and we saw this great opportunity with this technology to go back to Stryker and say, it may not be moving forward in the current situation at Stryker, but as entrepreneurs, we have the skill sets if we could license this and pursue it. And that's what we did. We gave them a great business plan, and that led to an exclusive license from Stryker for this technology, included all the patents and IP. It allowed us to essentially take it from that current state, which was very much at the technology only phase, and really, develop a plan. And that's what we've been working on since, bringing it, through the different channels of indications and opportunities that it could serve, working through the regulatory and clinical challenges, manufacturing the product, bringing it to a state where it, meets specifications at a high rigor of inspection before it goes into patients. That's where we're at right now. And we think that the next major phase of our company is to shuttle it through these clinical studies, right? We have to be experts at that. And then once it's on the market, that's where industry, the incumbents in the industry, the large medical orthopedic companies or the dental companies, they're going to be waiting for a product like this. They need the innovators like us, the entrepreneurs, to take the risk and to figure out a way, tremendous focus and passion, and to bring it through that process to them.
Sure, a licensing agreement is just dependent one-on-one how it's negotiated, but does Stryker get a right of first refusal on a sale, or do they have some upside on the back end of this?
They do have some upside. We were very careful because we knew that we would have to go out and raise funding from investors. We didn't want a term like a first right of refusal, because that means if somebody else offers a deal, they could swoop right in and take it. And so that kind of limits the upside for the investor return. So we were very careful to negotiate out a term like that. Obviously, that's very common in a lot of deals, especially in the pharmaceutical biotech world, where if you get a product to a certain point, then they'll swoop in and take it the next step, just because of the scale that's required for funding and for running large clinical trials. Yeah. So we were very careful about making sure that there wasn't a term like that in our deal. And ultimately, we worked with Stryker. It took us a while. We had to consult multiple business units because, again, it's a bone glue. It could be used anywhere. And so, we wanted to make sure everyone was on board with the deal. And I think the deal that we negotiated has been very good. We have a great relationship with Stryker. We have a great relationship with many other medical device companies, med tech companies that are out there. But we've continued to maintain our ties with Stryker, and they're excited to see the progress that we've made, especially in the indications that are important to them, whether it be craniomaxillofacial or extremity, orthopedic trauma. So we're just trying to get the product to market, and we'll see where things go once we have a commercialized product.
That's what I want to talk about next, because we've worked with and talked to so many companies that have fantastic products, and they get stuck right here. You've got the clinical trials, which are going to take some time and money, but then once you've got this proven concept and it's easy to see the value of what you're doing, how do you gain widespread commercialization? What's the plan for that?
Yeah. Well, I would just say, Grayson, you've got a lot, I know, to add to this, because there's many layers of topics in that question. I would say very, very early and throughout the course of RevBio's history and where we are today and where we will continue is our interactions with surgeons, because when we develop this product, we bring in surgeon groups and we go through an iterative process. We do cadaver studies, handling trials. We have them involved in our animal studies, and obviously they're involved translating it into human studies, and then they're involved in the human studies. That's where we are now. And so because they've been highly engaged, we're really thinking about like adoption. Well, how does it need to work in the surgical workflow, right? Like, who's going to prepare the product? What does that mean? And so there's a lot of individuals in a surgical room, and even in the healing process. What does it mean when a patient is discharged? How are they going to get back up on their feet? And so we're talking to providers at all stages of the treatment process. And I think because of that, when we think of our product, the main actor is the glue, but we think of the kit, how it's delivered to the operating room. What size offering do they need? Then we get into pricing, right? The pricing of our product for the various indications. What we charge in cranial may be very different than what we charge in dental. Well, how does that make sense, right? How come an orthopedic surgeon wouldn't just buy units of the dental product? Like, how do we position it all? And so there's many layers to that question. But I think what I would just say is that, working with surgeons and many of the providers in the system, we want to make sure that, we deliver a product to their operating room that they can use. It's easy to use in their workflow.
As a hand surgeon, I can see how the volume sold to dentistry might be pertinent, but certainly not to fill a big femoral gap.
It's interesting because dental, there are a lot of cases where patients have lost their teeth, and their jaw is receding significantly. So there's larger volumes of bone that we could use our material to rebuild. Point being said, the volumes in dental on par are lower than in other anatomical regions. And so how we sort of scale the pricing in sort of a linear fashion with a band to it is something that we've thought carefully about.
Jeff Cole, have you ever had tooth pulled and had to have a graft or anything?
Oh, well, you told your story earlier, but yeah, I'd had a situation where I did not have a permanent tooth.
Yeah.
And so when I was in high school, I had to have the so-called baby tooth pulled and had a titanium implant that reached 40 years of age until it broke. And so I'm one of these people that I had that drilled out. We had it bone grafted.
Right.
And I'm about a year and a half into just trying to find time in my schedule to go be reimplanted. And because it's where you can't really see it. I just haven't made that time. But yeah, if that could have been done in a single stage procedure, I'd probably already been outfitted by now.
When they put the bone graft in you, did they put like this net thing on top and like bits of bone all fall out in your mouth? Because that's what happened to me.
No, I mean, they found enough gum to close or whatever, but no, fortunately, I didn't have any issues getting through that. The problem is just finding time in my schedule to go back and be definitive about it.
Well, therein lies two different issues that kind of come together, because the existing bone grafts for dental are particulates. So they pack these little particles of bone graft in, and it's very hard to contain. So to your point, they use mesh or membranes, and they suture that in, or they use cages to kind of contain it all. And if not, it escapes. And now you're losing the bone graft. And so they have to go back in for another surgery. And it's like this do loop. And, with a material like an adhesive, when it goes in there, it's going to stay in there, and you don't need to add all these extra materials in to kind of like hold it down.
That's my point.
And then no one wants to go through all these surgeries, so they just kind of try to avoid it, and assume like if I don't think about it, nothing bad is happening. But the reality is like it's sort of like it's a decaying process. So if you don't get a dental implant supported tooth back in there and put load on that bone, from chewing or whatever, if you don't stimulate that bone, Wolf's Law says you will lose it. So it's just a nasty cascading process. And so we want to give surgeons all the, sort of ammo to sort of like get it done right up front. And then the patients will go in, and then hopefully, the major surgery is done, and they can sort of move on with their life.
Well, I can tell you, this is not a tangent. I'm just telling you from a personal experience. I had the 2 molars that I had removed. They put bone graft and little bits of cadaver. This is another person's bone that's the size of sand in your mouth. And it continuously comes out. There's no cage or net that's going to keep that in. Even after the gum heals over, it erodes out into your mouth. So you'll just be sitting around. All of a sudden, there's like a flake of someone else's bone. Of course, it's been sterilized. It's really gross. And I can tell you, there is no one on earth that would not rather have this stuff injected into their jaw and be a magic, plug in there that's hard in 2 minutes. I mean, I think you'll easily sell this to all the oral surgeons in the world, because it's just such a better process than the current technology.
Yeah, it's a synthetic product, so it's not someone else's bone, which has a lot of psychological benefits. But then, as Brian mentioned, it's kind of an elegant solution, because it's there, it does its job, and then it's replaced by native bone, and is resorbed by the body and goes away. And so, we think that's a real compelling factor. It's certainly great for the patient in that regard, but it's also great for the clinician, because they've, as we talked about, there are multiple processes to getting a prosthetic crown, where you have to go in, they have to do radiographs, they plan their surgery, they do an initial surgery where they extract the tooth, they put in the graft, they wait for it to osseointegrate. Sometimes it doesn't osseointegrate that well, so they have to do another grafting step. And then there are all these interim office visits where they have to check to make sure that the healing is going as anticipated. And sometimes it doesn't. And so they have to go back a step to go forward. So it is a complex process. And it makes sense that, when people have busy lives, especially doctors like you guys, it's hard to find time to schedule those appointments. And then if you don't, then, there are other downstream effects. So it's great for the clinicians too, the dentists, the practicing dentists, because, they get a lot of cancellations of appointments. They've got to move around their schedules. And each of these visits requires either radiograph, which has internal costs to their practice, or, they've got to re-sterilize their instruments because they have to go in and do more work. There's just a lot of costs. And then, of course, the cost of rescheduling and having holes in their schedule because of this, lost revenue. So we feel it's good for the patient. It's also good for the clinician. And so, we agree. We think there's a lot of reasons why people would want to adopt this, not only the patients, but also the dentists too, that do these types of complex grafting and implant placement procedures.
You mentioned 2 studies ongoing overseas, one dental. What's the nature of those in particular, just to stay on the dental topic? What's the nature of that study?
Sure.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Grayson.
We have two studies. We actually have a pivotal dental implant stabilization study going on in Europe. We've got multiple sites in different countries where we're handling many procedures. Each site is enrolling, and that will ultimately lead, upon success, to a CE marking, which is the commercialized state where we can start to sell the product. So we're nearing the end zone on that program in Europe. And so that's really exciting. Another dental program that we did was one of our advisors, and we have a great set of dental advisors that have done a lot of publishing. They've done a lot of research. They do a lot of lecturing. You'd call them key opinion leaders in terms of influencing the larger market. One of them in the UK has been looking at advancing that and trying to collapse even more elements of the procedure. And so we're still kind of assessing that, but it's kind of exciting work that he's done. So those are some of the dental studies that we're doing abroad.
I want to ask Jeff, I want to ask you a question. Since for our audience, you're an orthopedic surgeon. Could you envision someone breaking their arm, radius and ulna, and instead of being casted, have this done under fluoro where they just align the bones, set the bones, and then inject this and not require a cast or a limited duration cast? Johnny breaks his arm at school, the ER sends him to you, and then you repair this under fluoroscopic guidance percutaneously.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at the expected outcome of what we already do, and is that added cost? Is that shortening treatment or decreasing risk or complications? There are a lot of things that I imagine will just continue to do the same way. But you've got some bones that are really problematic and slow to heal, like the tibia, so are there some ways that we can change the fixation to where it's, whether it's close to the joint, periarticular, where right now maybe it's an incision, plate, screws, where maybe that converts to something that's really kind of a limited open approach, where you make a small incision, you slide a plate along the surface of the bone, and you just provide fixation at the top and the lower end, kind of ignore the comminution in between, and inject this graft into that area, as long as the joint surface is smooth. And again, you could probably put minimal fixation to secure that joint alignment, and then backfill graft that hardens, and that's a game changer compared to what we have now.
Guys, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think you hit both topics. Back to like the distal radius or the joint around the wrist. I mean, there's so many of those fractures, number one fracture in the body. I think you got to look at, some of them are relatively routine. You wouldn't touch any kind of changes from casting. Others are obviously going to go to an open surgery. But there's probably a swath in the middle where some guys are sending to surgery and others are not going to surgery. And you could say that, well, if there was a minimally invasive technique to avoid those that went to surgery, maybe you have a better solution, like you just said. On the other hand, you may have some that should have gone to surgery, but they didn't, and this would have been a nice solution. So if we could figure out in that Venn diagram, like where the boundaries are, there is a large market there just because of the sheer volume of fractures. And that's what a lot of orthopedic trauma surgeons have kind of said to us. There's some that are going to be obviously just stay with the standard of care, but others where potentially percutaneous treatment would work. But what they all say is that the lower extremity proximal tibia fracture that you talked about, when the tibia plateau is depressed, if you could inject this material in there and it provides adhesive fixation but filling abilities and then promotion of healing, that would be probably the highest value indication, or one of the highest value indications. And so I think you hit on both those indications well, and those are just some additional comments that I have.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff, no doubt.
Yep.
Well, guys, we've been going for a little over an hour. Was there anything that we didn't cover that you guys would like the audience to hear about, Jeff? Topics that you think we should touch on?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, as Grayson said, crossing that valley of death is where we are right now. We've done a remarkable job with grants. We continue to apply for grants. They're still available to us because we're a small business. And so those opportunities exist, but we need to augment. And we're at a stage now where we want to accelerate our clinical studies. And what I mean by that is, we're in the clinical stage, and with slower, smaller tranches of money, we can move things, along. But with more money at this stage, that's where we can start to see the scale up effects of enrolling more sites, and then with more sites, you get more patients enrolled, and help, sort of administering this study. And so the need for the capital is now. We work with angel investors. There's still opportunities through convertible notes to invest in us. But right now we're looking to raise a $5 million Series A with a very definitive milestone within the next year to finish our 2 pilot studies. One of them actually is a pivotal and one's a pilot study, one for dental, one for cranial. And that's going to be really helpful for us, because then we will finish the clinical proofs showing that this stuff works, and then the remaining steps, obviously, moving it through the FDA in the final stages of approval.
Just clarification for Grayson one. The $5 million, what's the post-money valuation on that? And this is part of the convertible note issuance, right?
Yes.
So we're actively raising convertible notes right now. We're pretty far into but there's still an opportunity if investors are interested in participating. That will it'll convert right into the Series A round, which will be a preferred class of stock. The post-money valuation we think is reasonable, but obviously the valuation at which that Series A round will be raised is going to be market dependent. And obviously there have been a lot of changes in the marketplace, depending upon where you go, indicate that things are starting to free up, that the IPO market's coming back, so investors are looking to deploy more money, those being the institutional investors that are obviously investing in later stage companies and looking for exits. So that's kind of our plan. We've really developed, I think, a strong foundation. We've been at this now for close to 10 years, and so we've built a real purpose-driven organization where we have a great design and development process, because obviously we're looking at lots of different indications. And so we have a great set of engineers. We have a matrix organization where we have a leader that pursues, an indication. And then we've got subject matter experts from biocompatibility to animal testing to mechanical testing, that basically complement each of those programs. And from a manufacturing standpoint, early on, we realized that to be taken seriously, we need to show that we have the right processes and procedures in place. So we actually went 2 years ago and got our ISO 1345 certification. And so we maintain that. We're actually coming up on another surveillance audit later this month. But, we take the process seriously. And in fact, companies can't even sell product in Europe unless they have that critical quality standard in place. And so we do that early on, invest in our infrastructure, so we're poised for growth.
Do you anticipate your first sales to be in Europe?
That's a really good question. We've got programs at different stages. It's almost like a horse race. We don't know who's going to win the race, but we've got, great activity here in the United States for cranial flap fixation. We look to go into a pivotal study at the end of this year. But then, of course, as we talked about, we've got a pivotal study going on in Europe for dental. So that might actually hit first. It all remains to be seen in terms of enrollment rates, and where we take these programs.
And speaking of horses, not to mention our vet program, because the vet program capitalizes on all the animal study we work with the various indications. So veterinarians now see this product as, wow, this could actually work really well in all these types of bone-related problems that they deal with. And for the same reasons, complicated hardware. And so our very first sale will likely be in the veterinary market. And we're looking at selling a product in the vet market potentially by the end of this year or early next year. And we're even looking at opportunities in the vet market, not only in the US, but also in Europe. So as Grayson said, many horses on the track, whether it's in the human space or the animal space. We have engineered up the product to work. And we're really looking to take that next big step into the commercial space so that we can start generating revenue.
That's great. I mean, Jeff Brown asked if you had any more nuggets to share. That vet piece it's interesting. Yeah.
I didn't even think of that. That's a whole nother multiple markets within veterinary medicine.
Yeah, exactly. We think we're ready to really take it to the next level, which is really the commercial phase. The clinical phase is where we're at. We got to get through that. But the commercial phase is when we see, obviously, the larger scale investors, because they see the risk is less. But then the incumbents in the space, like we talked about in the med tech industry, they're looking for products that are ready to go. And so if we can get that to them here, then it'll really be a horse race, because I think, that's where surgeons finally will get the product they've been asking for.
Well, from my perspective, I think it's nice that Stryker has that relationship with you, because, I mean, you've already got these reps in the room, Hey, doc, you want to try this new bone glue that augment your procedure? I mean,
yeah,
they've already got an ecosystem within the hospitals and so forth. So I think for some of those indications, it'll be easier for you guys. They're already in there with the hardware for the flaps and everything else. So, and they want you to succeed since they've got this relationship with RevBio.
Yeah, definitely for wide scale, product distribution. I mean, we would most likely partner with a company like a Stryker, because they've got the reach, they've got the deep relationships with existing hospital systems.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a more complex sale too, into these hospital systems where you have to go through a pricing committee. You've got to go through all those steps. However, we do, especially in the dental world, where we have, we've got great advisors, including advisors that were head of sales and marketing for some of the major dental implant companies. And so, we do want to launch at least some of the dental products initially through our advisory network, because a lot of our advisors teach classes, and there's a long sort of tradition and process of having study clubs, of having, CE education courses for new procedures, new techniques. And so we see that as a great way of reducing the product. But then, and obviously for scale up, we'll be partnering with distributors to get that broad reach. But we also want to do a controlled launch to make sure that people are trained on how to use the product properly, because it is a paradigm shift. It's a different type of product. It's not a standard bone graft. It's not a bone void filler. It's got other attributes, and how you apply it, how you use it. It is a change in practice. And so we want to make sure the clinicians are aware of that, and that they get the product in their hands, they get to trial it, they get to test it, feel it, see how they can use it, and then we would deploy it, obviously, from a commercial perspective.
Right.
I love it. Hope you guys understand what we do at Merge Medical is we highlight, interesting projects, and the goal is always to talk to groups that help physicians do their jobs, help the patients, and at least give us the opportunity to enrich ourselves financially. And you guys definitely check all the boxes. And I think it's been a real interesting conversation for us here. Brian Hess and Grayson Allen, C-suite of RevBio. I'm Dr. Jeff Brown with my co-host, Dr. Jeff Cole, for the Merge Medical Podcast. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.